In this video, we will be talking about Chapter 8, which focuses on families and their children with disabilities. This is a very important topic because we need to meet all students' individual needs, and it's inevitable that you're going to have children with disabilities in your classroom at some point in your career, and actually probably at every point of your career. So before we talk about how you will be responding to children with disabilities in your classroom, let's talk a little bit about how history has affected how people interact with children with special needs. Historically, people have been fearful of those who are different from them, and they stayed away as much as possible for fear of catching something that the person with the disability might have. However, families of children with disabilities are really no different than other families, because they all want their children to have an opportunity to develop, to learn, to socialize, and enjoy life overall. There were times in history when people would just abandon their children who were not considered whole, or would kill their babies, or sometimes they even used them in circus sideshows, which was very sad, and it just showed how much they did not understand the disabilities and how to deal with them. Sometimes people even thought that their children were demon-possessed, and some of them did really horrible things to their children to try to get rid of those demons. But in ancient times, there were some people who believed differently, and Hippocrates believed that emotional problems were natural, and they were physical problems instead of something spiritual. And Plato believed along the same lines, and he even took it a step further to say that people who were mentally unstable were not accountable for their behaviors and their own actions. But many times children with disabilities were included from their families or secluded from their families and were cared together in places like asylums or religious orders, and this practice actually continued even into the 20th century, which is really sad. There were some famous individuals during the 20th century who triumphed over their disabilities, and they made names for themselves, and they became, very noteworthy in what they did for people with disabilities. What this did really was start a conversation about how people with disabilities should be cared for and treated, and the value that should be placed on their lives as well. And one of those was Helen Keller, who, as we all know, has a wonderfully triumphant story. Another one was Pearl Buck, who wrote The Child Who Never Grew. She was a child who, this was written about a child who was cognitively challenged, but actually never diagnosed. And this provided families kind of something to grab onto, a level of support. And it led to a lot of parental support groups, because before this, these children were never talked about. They were kind of hidden from sight. But when people started writing things about them and being open with their families, then it led to the availability of support groups for other parents. Christy Brown, who was born in 1932, she had cerebral palsy, and the doctors at that time wanted to diagnose her as being mentally retarded, and her family really fought for her, and she made a name for herself. She became an author, a painter, so she was pretty fantastic and triumphed over her disabilities as well, and she brought a lot of notoriety and attention to the problem that had been seen with children with disabilities. And John Dewey was one of the major proponents of child-centered education, as we all know by now, and therefore he was a huge advocate of individualizing education, no matter what the ability or disability a child might have. This also led to a nationwide conversation, and which ultimately led to reform of the school system. And we'll talk about how this happened in just a little while when we talk about inclusion and the laws that are now helping children with disabilities have an equal education. One of the biggest reasons that people with disabilities were starting to be viewed differently during the mid-20th century was because of Franklin Roosevelt and his bout with polio when he was president. People began to realize that if a person in a wheelchair could actually be president, then maybe people who had other types of disabilities could actually have valuable things to contribute to our society as well. President Kennedy also had a sister who was cognitively challenged, and he was instrumental in pushing some legislation through that started programs for special education. So he was a huge proponent of those programs. Also, Vice President Hubert Humphrey had a granddaughter with Down syndrome, and so he pushed for programs for early special education for young children. So there are several laws that affect children with disabilities, and some of them are a little bit confusing because some of them were the initial laws, some of them were updated laws of the initial one, and they all have different names. But what's important is that we recognize that there are laws that now govern how children with disabilities get serviced at school, and how they have individualized education plans that help them with the things that they need help with. Now, back in 1965, President Johnson actually started Head Start, and this was really for disadvantaged children. They could be from poverty. That's really why it was started. But it also started the conversation about how to help children who have all different kinds of abilities. So then in 1975, there was a law that was implemented, and it laid the foundation for reform, and it also was a renewed commitment to educating all children, not just children with regular abilities, but children with disabilities. And this was the original Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's been amended several times now. But in 1986, there was an added part to the law where it mandated services for children ages birth to 2 and education for ages 3 to 5. So these laws encouraged family involvement and helping those children get all the services that they need for their disabilities to be successful in school. Okay, so there have been 4 different reauthorizations of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and I went over some of those already, but there are 3 different parts to IDEA that are really important. The first part is early intervention. In other words, people like parents, teachers, going to schools, going to homes, seeing those children and doing those early screenings so we can find out their needs and assess those needs and get them services early. The second one is early childhood special education. So once those needs are assessed and identified, then to get them that early services that they need. And then the third part is the special education and transition. And we will talk about the parts of the special education in just a minute. So here are the 6 principles. So we have 0 rejection, which means children cannot be turned away for education. They have a free education just like everybody else. The second one is non-discriminatory evaluation, which basically means that if you are doing an assessment on a child with disabilities, then their evaluation needs to be modified to meet their individualized education plan. Number 3, free appropriate education. In other words, they're going to get the education that they need just like every other student. Number 4, least restrictive environment, which means that at times it might be in the regular classroom, but at times it might be with a specialist. It might be in a different area, maybe to get some occupational therapy or things of that sort, but whatever is best for that student. Number 5 is procedural due process, which means that the parents have a process that they can go through to appeal things or to advocate for their children. And that goes along with number 6, which is parental and student participation. In other words, the parents and the students themselves can participate in the choices that are made for them through meetings with the special ed directors, the teachers, and all those other special services people that are involved. And then IDEA in 2004 was signed by President Bush, and it aligned those special education things with the No Child Left Behind Act to make sure that those improvements were made for special education students as well. So really, what is inclusion? It's educating students with and without disabilities all within the regular classroom. In other words, they're not going to be segregated and separated from each other to the maximum extent possible. Sometimes students with certain disabilities will have to leave the classroom for certain things, but mostly they're all in it together. Also, services are provided to infants and toddlers and are family directed, and so those families are involved in the conversation. So the least restrictive environment, like I said before, depends on the child's needs, and those will be assessed by the school and by doctors and by parents and everybody involved. And that is the end of this chapter 8. We will also have a guest speaker, Minda Cox, and she will talk to us more about the parts about being a child with disabilities, and also how parents and teachers can work together, and what teachers can do to make those children who do have disabilities be comfortable in their classrooms. And so we'll listen to her in the next session.